I am going to be, I'm not a baseball person, so I'm probably, but batting cleanup, I think is what we call that. I don't do baseball, but I'm going to bring it on home with our last little bits of presentations, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So types of institutions and jobs, and a lot of this we've covered in some capacity, so I'll be able to keep things moving. So I want us to understand the types of institutions, types of positions, and then if people have questions about words they have been hearing that they don't know what they mean. So just to get things moving, R1s. R1s are the top tier of research institutions. They are places where the emphasis is on research, the institutional level. They are thinking of themselves as producing research, as opposed to, as we just heard, this SLAC type school, right, the small liberal arts college. The orientation and the branding is a little bit different, and it's important to know which type of place you're at. And then there are a lot of, we often divide it into R1s and SLACs, but there's actually other things out there. So regional universities or colleges, something like Fairfield or Gonzaga, where I am. I didn't mention, I'm a assistant professor at Gonzaga in Spokane in Eastern Washington. So, but there's a lot of these schools where you probably aren't going to be teaching graduate students, but they are, properly speaking, a university, right? We have graduate programs, which is usually the thing that distinguishes a college from a university. We do have graduate programs at Gonzaga, but not in classics. And so in a lot of ways, many of these places are more like a SLAC in their orientation, but it's good to know how a university thinks of itself, what is the image they're putting out there, and how does the department think of themselves? Community colleges, we often overlook these when we're talking about applications and things. Community colleges are much more likely to have a generalist. They're looking for more generalist, ancient history, something like that, as opposed to something like an R1, where at an R1, you are going to be doing something quite specialized generally. You will be the tragedy person, or you will be the Homer person, as opposed to, like Sonia had mentioned, right, at Gonzaga, there's two of us. So I am all of the Greek stuff and sometimes Roman stuff. But I just want to talk a little bit about, for folks who, and this is very much focused on the US. If folks want to talk, I'm not an expert on the UK or Europe. Canada is a little different. A lot of this applies to Canada, but not 100%. So public schools versus private schools, there's just going to be different things that are part of the culture, part of how things work, things that institutions are required to do, things that you're not allowed to do at different types of institutions. So within public schools, these are usually state schools of some sort. It will vary between, if you're in the Midwest, it's worth knowing if you're talking about a land grant institution. So Michigan and Michigan State, both public, but they are differently oriented, I guess you could say. Land grant institutions generally started as agricultural schools, as opposed to things that started as more of a university system. So, you know, if you have questions about any of these details, please reach out. I'd be happy to dig in a little bit more. Private schools, whole big range of private schools. There's private schools that are private because they are religiously affiliated. There are private schools that are private just because they're not public. So something like our Ivies, for example, the Ivy League colleges are private. Most of them do not have a particular religious affiliation, as opposed to something like BYU, Georgetown, Notre Dame. These all have specific religious affiliations. And then you get things that are sort of oddly on the cusp there. So there are ones that are like ideologically private schools. Hillsdale is one in Michigan that is very sort of libertarian oriented. And so it's important to know these things because it's going to very much impact what, if not the department itself, they're probably the department itself, but the institution as a whole. Hiring has to go through deans, has to go through provosts, has to go through higher ups. Once the department decides whatever they want to hire, it has to go through higher ups. And it's important to know what those higher up expectations. Some places will have codes of conduct and things. BYU has certain rules, conduct rules. Notre Dame is shooting for over 50% Catholic faculty. That is not the case at Georgetown, Gonzaga, other Catholically affiliated colleges. So these are just important things to know in terms of the things you do or don't want to mention or highlight in your letters. or your cover letter, your application materials. HBCUs, these are historically Black colleges and universities. There are a bunch of them, primarily in the east and south of the country. Howard's probably the most well-known, but there are a bunch. HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, that is less part of a university's mission or orientation and more a factor of the demographics. So a lot of schools in California, for instance, are Hispanic serving institutions if more than a certain percentage of your students identify as Latinx. And I don't know exactly what the things on that are, where the cutoff is, but as opposed to, you may see schools occasionally described as PWIs, predominantly white institutions, right? This gives you, some of these are more, and HBCU is a specific designation. Some of these are going to be things that are more just a factor of the demographics, and those things can change over time. Single gender colleges. A lot of these are in flux right now, as a lot of the all women's colleges are thinking about accepting people of all marginalized identities. So the single gender colleges are really predicated on kind of a gender binary, and a lot of this is changing, but there are schools that in some capacity, the student body is primarily or exclusively a certain gender. That does not usually mean that the faculty need to be. So it is worth knowing that you can, oops, went the wrong way there. You can apply to teach, for example, at Smith, a lot of the classics department. There are several men teaching in the classics department, even though it is a women's college. And then our types of jobs. We've talked about a lot of this, but I just want to real quick run down the list here. Tenured, that is a senior hire. So people who are coming in, they generally already have tenure somewhere else, and they are being hired in at a senior position. Tenure track, that is, you will generally be coming in as an assistant professor, and you will be eligible for tenure at a certain point, and that can vary based on the institution, what the requirements are. If you can get credit for some years in advance, and we can talk about some of those details. Teaching faculty, this is part of the non-tenure track, and oftentimes these will be a 3-year contract as opposed to a 1-year contract when you're up for renewal for those. And the focus is primarily on that teaching. You might run a language program, but it is a teaching specific position. And there are more of these, more institutions are having teaching faculty where the expectation is not publications. Postdoc, these can vary in number of years. It is research, there's a lot of research involved and saving you some time to be advancing research, but a lot of them do have a teaching component as well. You'll want to read that job ad carefully. Visiting assistant professor, these are temporary, usually 1 to 2 year positions, sometimes 1 year with a potential for renewal for a 2nd year, but they are fixed term. So this is not a permanent position. Lecturer and teaching faculty are similar. A lot of it varies by institution, but a lecturer can effectively be a permanent position, but you will often have to be renewed every so often number of years. There's more and more, there is a promotion kind of ladder that you can have there. Adjunct is where you're going to be paid by the class for the most part. And that is a very, very temporary, very insecure and pretty exploitative situation. But there are reasons that people, would want to pursue adjunct positions but everything else has somewhat more security than an adjunct position does. We're going to be transitioning from here into our Q&A session. So I want to, just before we jump into general Q&A, are there job type lingos that you need more information on? And I will pull up the chat and see if we got anything in there. Some potential things that we could, not many people have to decide between multiple tenure track offers these days. The job market is not so good that that's a problem most people have. But on occasion, you'll be in a position where you might have an offer from a tenure track position and a postdoc, or a non-tenure track position and a postdoc, or something where you might want to think about, is a VAP versus a postdoc, what's going to be better for your career trajectory. And then, if you did have multiple tenure track offers, you could think about what types of institutions are going to be a better fit for you. But the reality is, given what the job market is right now, I applied to everything I remotely qualified for if I could possibly sell myself as being what they were looking for, including like an ancient historian, which is not really, I'm a tragedy person. But you know, I would apply to as much as you possibly can, just because the worst they can do is say no. And maybe they look at your application and they're like, wow, this actually sounds great. So unfortunately, you're going to get a lot of rejection or just get ghosted by departments sometimes, as Erica mentioned. And I think it's always worth the risk to apply, even if you're not a perfect fit, because the worst that can happen is they say no. And then I have a lot of thoughts about the compromises you can or should make to cater to a particular institution. So if folks want to talk about that, I would be happy to open up that conversation, but I'm going to stop my share for now, take a look at